Bullies punched a homeless man. Big mistake. He was a UFC veteran. Corbin Thorne shuffled through Riverside Park with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that moving too quickly drew unwanted attention. His weathered face was hidden beneath an overgrown beard, and clothes that had seen too many nights on concrete made him appear older than his years. The torn jacket and worn boots with holes told the story of a man who had fallen far. The park served as his unofficial home base, a sprawling green space downtown where the city's forgotten gathered during daylight hours before security moved them along at sunset. Corbin had claimed a bench near the basketball courts, close enough to public restrooms and water fountains to meet his basic needs. 3 months on the streets had taught him the rhythms of this place. Morning joggers who pretended not to see him, lunch-hour workers who crossed streets when he approached, families who hurried children past his bench with whispered warnings. "Look what we have here," a voice cut through his thoughts like broken glass. Trent McCready emerged from behind the basketball courts with his usual crew. Trent was built like a linebacker, all muscle and swagger, with aggressive confidence that came from never facing real consequences. Bryce Kellerman flanked him, shorter but stockier, with dead eyes and scarred knuckles that suggested violence was more hobby than outlet. Madison Cole stood on Trent's left, her cruel smile and expensive workout gear marking her as someone who participated in cruelty for entertainment. Corbin kept his head down, hoping they would lose interest and move on to harass someone else. He had been avoiding confrontation for months, not out of fear, but from deeper understanding of what violence truly cost. The disciplines he had mastered in another life remained locked away, buried beneath layers of grief and guilt that kept him from accessing the skills that had once defined him. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Trent said, stopping directly in front of Corbin's bench. "You can't just ignore us." "I don't want any trouble," Corbin replied quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. Bryce laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the basketball courts. "Trouble? We're not trouble. We're community service, cleaning up the neighborhood." Madison circled behind the bench like a predator, her phone already out and recording. This is perfect content. Local heroes confront vagrant problem. The casual cruelty in her voice made Corbin's hands clench involuntarily, muscle memory threatening to surface before he forced it back down. His therapist at the VA had warned him about triggers, about how trauma could make simple situations feel like life or death battles. He couldn't afford to lose control, not when he had nothing left to lose, except his freedom. "Please," he said, gathering the few possessions scattered around his bench. "I'll move somewhere else." "You'll move when we tell you to move," Trent replied, stepping closer. "First, we're going to have a little conversation about property values and public decency." Other park visitors noticed the confrontation, but their responses followed a predictable pattern. Joggers altered routes to avoid involvement. Parents steered children toward playground equipment on the opposite side, and elderly couples found sudden interest in feeding ducks rather than witnessing whatever was about to unfold. "You see," Trent continued, clearly performing for Madison's camera and any other witnesses who might be watching, "when decent people try to enjoy public spaces, they shouldn't have to deal with this." He gestured dismissively at Corbin's appearance. "Public spaces are for the public," Corbin said quietly. "I'm not bothering anyone." "Your existence bothers people," Bryce interjected. "Your smell bothers people. The way you make families feel unsafe bothers people." The words stung because they contained enough truth to wound effectively. Corbin knew how he looked, how he smelled after days without proper washing facilities, how his presence made others uncomfortable. But understanding their perspective didn't make the cruelty easier to bear. Madison moved closer with her phone, clearly hoping to capture something dramatic for whatever social media platform would host her content. "Say something for the camera," she instructed Corbin. "Tell everyone why you think you deserve to take up space in a family park." "I don't," Corbin replied. the words scraping his throat like sandpaper. "Don't what?" Trent pressed. "Deserve to take up space." The admission seemed to energize his tormentors. Madison's grin widened behind her phone screen. Bryce cracked his knuckles in anticipation, and Trent's posture shifted into something more aggressive. "Finally," Trent said with satisfaction. "Some self-awareness, but saying it isn't enough. You need to show everyone here that you understand your place." Corbin looked around the park at faces that were either staring at him with curiosity or working very hard to avoid looking in his direction. A few people had their own phones out now, drawn by the promise of drama playing out in real time. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Crawl," Bryce said simply. "Get on your hands and knees and crawl away from this bench like the animal you are." The demand hung in the air like a physical blow. Several witnesses looked uncomfortable with how far things had escalated, but none of them moved to intervene. They just watched, frozen between disgust at what they were seeing and reluctance to get involved in a situation that didn't directly affect them. Corbin felt something ancient and dangerous stir in his chest, something that had once made him one of the most feared heavyweights in mixed martial arts, before everything went wrong. Before the accident that killed his training partner, before the guilt that drove him to drink, before the spiral that cost him everything he had worked to build. But he forced that part of himself back into the darkness where it belonged. "I'll just leave," he said, starting to stand. That's when Trent made his first mistake. He placed a heavy hand on Corbin's shoulder and shoved him back down onto the bench hard enough to rattle his teeth. "Nobody said you could stand up," Trent said, his voice carrying across the park. "We're not finished with our conversation." The physical contact changed everything, awakening reflexes that Corbin had spent years trying to suppress. His body recognized the threat before his mind could rationalize it away. And for a moment, the trained fighter he used to be flickered behind his eyes like lightning in storm clouds. Madison was practically vibrating with excitement behind her camera. "This is amazing content," she whispered to Bryce. "This is going viral for sure." "You know what?" Trent said, apparently inspired by his audience's enthusiasm. "I think our friend here needs a more memorable lesson, something that really drives the point home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, holding it just out of Corbin's reach. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to get on your hands and knees, bark like a dog 3 times, and then maybe I'll give you this money for food." Gasps rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. This had crossed a line that made even the most apathetic witnesses uncomfortable, but still, no one moved to intervene. Corbin stared at the money, knowing it represented 2 days of meals from the soup kitchen. His stomach cramped with hunger that had become so familiar, it was like an old friend, and his pride warred with his survival instincts. "Come on," Madison urged, her camera trained on his face. "Everyone's waiting. Don't disappoint your audience." "This is sick," someone in the crowd muttered, but they didn't speak up loudly enough to matter. Corbin closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment he heard a voice that didn't belong to any of his tormentors. "Hey, stop it!" He looked up to see Elena Vasquez pushing through the crowd, her volunteer badge from the downtown soup kitchen visible on her jacket. Elena was one of the few people who had shown him kindness since he'd been living on the streets, always greeting him by name, always treating him like a human being worthy of basic respect. "Leave him alone," Elena said firmly, stepping between Corbin and his tormentors. "He hasn't done anything to you." Trent turned his attention to this new challenger with obvious amusement. Well, the homeless guy has a girlfriend." "I work with the Homeless Advocacy Program," Elena replied, her voice steady despite being outnumbered 3-1. "And what you're doing here is illegal harassment," Bryce laughed. "Illegal? We're having a conversation in a public park. Nothing illegal about that." "Forcing someone to degrade themselves for money is harassment," Elena shot back, "and I'm recording everything for the police report." Madison's expression soured, as she realized her viral content might become evidence in a criminal case. "Put your phone away, lady. This doesn't concern you." "Someone being humiliated concerns everyone," Elena replied, not backing down despite the obvious threat in Madison's voice. Trent studied Elena with the calculating look of a predator, deciding whether new prey was worth the effort. "You know what your problem is," he said, moving closer to her. "You enable this behavior. You make it easier for people like him to be parasites instead of contributing to society." Elena didn't flinch. "And you make it easier for people like yourself to forget that everyone deserves basic human dignity." The confrontation was escalating beyond what Corbin could allow. Elena was risking herself for his sake, and the guilt of that was worse than any physical pain Trent could inflict. She didn't know what he was capable of, didn't understand that he was choosing not to fight rather than being unable to defend himself. "Elena," he said quietly, "just walk away. I can handle this." "No," she replied without taking her eyes off Trent. "I'm not leaving you alone with these bullies." Trent's face darkened at being called a bully, his masculine pride clearly stung by the accurate assessment. "Bully? I'm providing a public service, cleaning up the trash that makes decent people uncomfortable." He stepped closer to Elena, using his size advantage to intimidate. "Maybe you need the same lesson he does. Maybe you both need to understand how the real world works." That's when everything changed. Bryce, perhaps emboldened by Trent's aggression, decided to grab Elena's phone to stop her recording. As his hand shot toward her, Corbin moved with reflexes that belonged to someone who had spent 15 years training to hurt people efficiently. The movement was so fast that most witnesses missed the details. One moment, Bryce was reaching for Elena's phone, and the next moment he was on his back on the concrete path, gasping for air and staring up at Corbin with wide, shocked eyes. "Don't touch her," Corbin said, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone in earshot take an involuntary step backward. Trent spun around to face this new version of the broken man he'd been tormenting for weeks. What the hell just happened? "Your friend learned about consequences," Corbin replied, straightening to his full height for the first time since arriving in this park. Without the defeated slump he usually carried, he was taller than Trent had realized, broader through the shoulders, with a presence that suggested violence was a tool he knew how to use expertly. Madison had stopped recording, her phone forgotten, as she backed away from the sudden shift in dynamics. The crowd of onlookers pressed closer, sensing that something significant was happening, but uncertain what they were witnessing. Bryce struggled to sit up, his face red with humiliation and dawning fear. "He sucker-punched me." "No," Eleanor said firmly, her phone still recording everything. "He defended me when you tried to grab my phone. That's self-defense." Trent looked between his fallen friend and the homeless man who was somehow no longer behaving like a victim. "You're going to regret that," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Corbin asked mildly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your friend just learned that actions have consequences. Would you like the same lesson?" The question carried weight that made Trent hesitate for the first time since this confrontation began. Something about Corbin's posture, his balance, the way he held his hands, suggested that fighting him would be a very different experience than bullying him. Madison found her voice first. "Trent, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Trent's pride wouldn't allow retreat, especially not in front of an audience that had watched him dominate the situation for weeks. "I'm not backing down from some homeless freak." He swung at Corbin with a wild haymaker that telegraphed its intention from miles away. To someone who had spent years studying human movement, analyzing opponents, learning to read body language like a second language, Trent's attack was laughably obvious. Corbin slipped the punch with minimal effort, grabbed Trent's extended arm, and used the larger man's momentum to send him crashing into the nearby trash can with enough force to scatter garbage across the walking path. The crowd erupted in surprised shouts and excited chatter as phones appeared to document this dramatic reversal. Trent struggled to extract himself from the mess of discarded food containers and torn plastic bags, his expensive clothes now stained and reeking. "Stay down," Corbin advised calmly. "Please don't make this worse for yourself." But Trent was beyond rational thought, his humiliation driving him to fury that overwhelmed any tactical thinking. He charged at Corbin again, this time trying to tackle him to the ground through brute force. The takedown attempt was textbook poor execution against someone who had spent a decade defending against world-class grapplers. Corbin sidestepped, caught Trent's momentum, and executed a perfect hip toss that sent him flying through the air to land hard on his back on the concrete path. Bryce had finally managed to stand up, but one look at his leader sprawled, groaning on the ground, convinced him that joining the fight would be suicide. He held his hands up in surrender when Corbin's gaze shifted to him. "I'm good," Bryce said quickly. "We're good. No more problems here." Madison was frantically deleting video from her phone, perhaps realizing that her documentation of harassment had become evidence of assault against someone who was clearly capable of defending himself and others. Trent rolled onto his side, coughing and trying to catch his breath. When he looked up at Corbin, the arrogant confidence that had defined him was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect mixed with healthy fear. "Who are you?" he gasped. Corbin helped Elena to her feet before answering, his movements gentle and protective, in stark contrast to the efficiency with which he'd dismantled two attackers, someone who knows the difference between strength and cruelty. Elena was staring at him with amazement. "Corbin, how did you—" "Long story," he replied, but his tone was softer when he spoke to her than it had been with anyone else in months. By now, a significant crowd had gathered, and several people were openly recording the aftermath of the confrontation. Corbin realized that within hours, video of the incident would be spreading across social media, probably with captions about homeless veterans or unexpected heroes. "Please," he said to the crowd generally, "this is over. Everyone can go back to their day." Most people began to disperse, but a few lingered, perhaps hoping for additional drama or clarity about what they'd just witnessed. Among them was Derek Rodriguez, a security guard from the nearby community center who had watched the entire incident unfold. "Sir," Derek approached cautiously, his hand resting near his radio. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Trent struggled to sit up, his face red with pain and embarrassment. "I'm fine," he muttered, though he was clearly anything but fine. "I wasn't talking to you," Derek replied, his attention focused on Corbin. "Are you hurt?" "No," Corbin said simply. "Thank you for asking." Derek nodded, then looked at Trent and his crew with obvious disgust. "I've seen you guys harassing people in this park before. This is the last time. Next time I see you bothering anyone, I'm calling real police instead of just park security." Madison helped Trent to his feet, while Bryce gathered scattered contents of the overturned trash can, all three of them moving with the defeated urgency of people who wanted to escape as quickly as possible. As they limped away, Eleanor turned to Corbin with questions written across her face. "You're not just homeless, are you?" Corbin was quiet for a long moment, watching Trent's group disappear toward the park's main entrance. "I am homeless," he said finally, "but you're right that it's not the whole story." Elena waited patiently while Corbin organized his thoughts, perhaps sensing that whatever he was about to share wasn't easy for him to discuss. "I used to fight," he said eventually. "Professionally. Mixed martial arts, UFC-level competition. I was good at it." "What happened?" Elena asked gently. I hurt someone, Corbin replied, his voice heavy with old grief. Training accident. My sparring partner, my best friend, he never woke up from the coma. Elena's expression softened with understanding. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Corbin asked. I was the one with more experience. I was supposed to control the situation, protect my partner, make sure training stayed safe. Instead, I killed my best friend with my bare hands. The confession hung between them like a bridge across years of isolation and guilt. Eleanor reached out tentatively, placing her hand on Corbin's arm with the kind of gentle contact he hadn't experienced since losing everything. Accidents happen, she said firmly. That's why they're called accidents. Tell that to his family, Corbin replied. Tell that to everyone who trusted me to use my skills responsibly. Elena was quiet for a moment, processing this new information. Is that why you didn't fight back before, even though you could have? Corbin nodded. I swore I'd never hurt anyone again. No matter what they did to me, no matter how much I wanted to fight back, I couldn't risk becoming that person who destroys everything he touches. But you fought back today. Because they were going to hurt you, Corbin said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. And I couldn't let that happen. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond their circumstances and reached towards something deeper. Elena had shown him kindness when everyone else saw only problems, and Corbin had revealed skills he'd kept hidden to protect her when she needed protection. Over the following weeks, the dynamic in Riverside Park shifted dramatically. Word spread through the homeless community about what had happened, and suddenly Corbin found himself treated with respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition of someone who had stood up for the defenseless. Other members of the park's regular population began approaching him for advice, protection, or simply conversation. The man who had been invisible for months became a central figure in an informal community that had previously existed without leadership or protection. Elena became a regular presence in his life, bringing him coffee from the community center where she worked, sitting with him on his bench during her lunch breaks, treating him like someone whose opinions and experiences mattered. I've been thinking about what you said, she told him one afternoon, as they watched pickup basketball games on the courts where he'd once been humiliated, about swearing never to hurt anyone again. It seemed like the right thing to do, Corbin replied. Maybe, Eleanor said thoughtfully. But maybe the right thing is learning when violence is necessary and when it isn't, rather than avoiding it completely. Corbin considered her words carefully. My therapist used to say something similar, that the opposite of violence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's enabling more violence by refusing to stop it. Smart therapist. Yeah, Corbin agreed sadly. I should have listened better. 2 months after the confrontation, Corbin was surprised to see Trent approaching his bench alone, without his usual crew and without any apparent hostile intent. Eleanor was sitting beside Corbin, and she tensed as she recognized their former tormentor. It's okay, Corbin said quietly, though his body remained ready for conflict. Trent stopped a respectful distance away, his hands visible and non-threatening. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice lacking any of the swagger that had once defined him. For what specifically? Elena asked, her tone protective. For everything, Trent replied, looking directly at Corbin. For treating you like you were less than human. For trying to humiliate you in front of everyone. For thinking that having a home and a job gave me the right to decide who deserved basic respect. Corbin studied Trent's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, he found something that looked like genuine shame and the beginning of wisdom. What changed your mind? He asked. Trent was quiet for a moment. Watching that video afterward, seeing myself from the outside, seeing what I looked like when I thought I had power over someone else, and realizing that the only difference between us was luck and circumstances that could change any time. Elena glanced at Corbin, perhaps wondering how he would respond to this unexpected development. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were," Corbin said finally. "The question is what you do with that chance." "I'm trying to figure that out," Trent admitted, "but I wanted to start by saying I was wrong. About everything." As Trent walked away, Elena squeezed Corbin's hand gently. "That took courage," she observed. "For him or for me?" Corbin asked. "Both," Elena replied. "Accepting an apology can be harder than giving one." That evening, as they walked together toward the community center where Elena worked, Corbin reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that afternoon in the park. Standing up for Elena had forced him to confront the part of himself he'd been hiding, not just from others, but from himself. "I've been thinking about something," Elena said as they paused outside the center's entrance. "There's an opening for a security position here, someone who understands what our clients go through, who can protect them when they need protection." Corbin looked up at the building that had been feeding him for months, considering the possibility of belonging somewhere again rather than just surviving. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." "The Corbin who protected me is ready," Elena said confidently. "The question is whether you're ready to forgive yourself enough to use your skills for good instead of hiding them away." 6 months later, Corbin stood in the same park where he'd once been humiliated, but everything was different now. He wore the uniform of a community center security officer, and his presence brought comfort rather than discomfort to the families and individuals who used the space. Elena worked at a folding table nearby, registering people for social services with the kind of patience and compassion that had first drawn his attention to her kindness. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did in any public space, Corbin handled them with the same precision he'd once brought to professional fighting. But now, that precision was aimed at de-escalation rather than destruction, at protecting the vulnerable rather than dominating opponents. The most important lesson hadn't come from his years of professional training or his experience on the streets, but from understanding that true strength wasn't about what you could do to others. It was about what you chose not to do, and when you chose to act despite the cost to yourself. Standing in that park now, Corbin carried himself with quiet confidence that came from accepting all parts of himself, and he had learned that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up and using what you'd learned to help others avoid the same impact.